I think it's a sign of the immaturity of the left. I mean, the Kennedy administration had some charisma. So, Jackie Kennedy, everybody was supposed to think was wonderful, and John F. Kennedy was this great figure. I mean, it's all public relations nonsense. The Kennedy administration was the first one to realize that you could use television as a organizing technique. I mean, television was, had been there, but it was just coming to the point where you could actually use it. So it was a highly televised administration. Also, the Kennedy administration had one bright idea. They knew that if you treat intellectuals nicely, you pretend you like them, you invite them to dinner and so on, you're going to get a good image. And that's what happened. I mean, in Cambridge, where I live, it was just like a joke during the Kennedy years. I mean, every morning, the Harvard and MIT faculty would go to the airport to take the shuttle to Washington so they could have lunch with Jackie Kennedy and talk about Proust and, meet George Bundy, who would say, "What a nice person you are." And, I mean, they had total contempt for them, of course, but they treated them nicely. And the result is they got this wonderful image. And the left was caught up in it. Also, don't forget that during the Kennedy years, there was very little protest. I mean, on the war, nothing. The civil rights issue was muddled. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the Kennedys were very strongly opposed to the civil rights movement. I mean, if you were down in the South, you could see it. I mean, I was down in a demonstration in Jackson, Mississippi, where literally the state police were, they were very vicious. They were they were beating demonstrators and gassing them and, all the things used. Demonstrators fled up to the steps of the federal building where the state police are not allowed to go. And it was lined with federal marshals, which had been sent from Washington, theoretically, to protect the demonstrators. In fact, they threw the demonstrators back on the streets so that the state police could beat them bloody, And Kennedy didn't want all of that. He was kind of dragged into it, finally, because there was so much, it was becoming such a big public issue. You just, the Alabama sheriffs, you just couldn't say, "I like them" anymore. I mean, they were really kind of like Nazis. And so they finally went along. But they created an image as if they were responsible for it. You go to black homes in Mississippi, people have pictures of Kennedy up there. If you know what happened, it's and the left intellectuals were the same. So you have to have this illusion that we had this wonderful country, and then some awful people took it away. I mean, and Lyndon Johnson was a good, he was well cast for the role. He's a vulgar Texan man of the people, not a smart guy like us wearing a tie. And he was a kind of a populist figure. Actually, he was much more liberal than Kennedy was. I mean, all of the decent legislation and so on Johnson pushed through. I mean, he's also a racist and everything else, but and was vulgar, but he didn't have the veneer of the Kennedys. So, he talked with obscene words and stuff like that. And he was easy to hate. So you could easily concoct a story that we had this wonderful country, which was doing these great things and noble and so on. And we were part of it because we were the intellectuals. And then it was all taken away from us by the, these assassins, Johnson or somebody or other. And it's just a tempting story. I mean, it's nice to believe that there was a golden age that we were part of. I mean, in fact, the Kennedy years were some of the worst years in the history of the country. Assassination case where there is a plausible case, I don't know if you can show it, is the King assassination. I mean, there would have been a real motive. King was killed at a point where he was making a painful transition from being a religious civil rights leader to being a poor people's organizer. And that's when his reputation started to collapse, I mean,
the housing.
He was killed when he was there for a demonstration of kind of a poor people's conference, garbage collectors and things like that. And he was changing the way he was talking. He was shifting to sort of class issues. I mean, as long as you talk about evil Alabama sheriffs, then everybody in the North can feel very self-righteous. applauding you. But when you start talking about class issues, which go right home, they go right back to Boston, which is more racist than the South, that's no good anymore. And he was moving in that direction very clearly. He also came out with not terribly strong, but criticism of the Vietnam War at a time when it wasn't yet fashionable to do so. So there's at least a motivation. I mean, the Kennedy case, there's no motivation. He was one of the most hawkish members of the administration. And in fact, the policies went on without change at all. It's just, look through the documentary record, there's no change. Actually, there's another factor about the Kennedy administration. After the Tet Offensive, January 1968, the American business classes realized that this is a bad business. I mean, they kind of hoped that the whole damn thing would go away, and there would be... the one thing that the peace movement succeeded in doing was building up enough opposition so that Johnson could never really declare a national mobilization. So they had to fight a kind of what they called a guns and butter war. They had to kind of keep people quiet and meanwhile fight the war, and the war was getting bigger and bigger. And that's very bad for the economy. So you get stagflation and so on. I mean, if you can call a national mobilization, so like during the Second World War, it's terrific for the economy. I mean, the best period of U.S. economic history. Now, these command economies work very well. It was the same in England. I mean, a great period in English economic history was during the war. And the same in Germany and so on. But they couldn't do it in the 60s because there was too much opposition. So they ran this, they tried to coddle the public with goods and so on, and nevertheless pay what was becoming a pretty expensive war. Tet Offensive made it clear that this was going to go on forever. There was the most dramatic power play in American history. I mean, if political scientists were not totally dishonest, this is the first thing you would teach everybody. This teaches exactly how the country runs. A delegation of what they called wise men, big financiers from Wall Street and these guys, they went down to Washington right after the Tet Offensive, and they basically gave Johnson his marching orders. I mean, they ordered him, you're not going to run for president, you got to stop the bombing in North Vietnam, you got to go into negotiations in Paris, and he very dutifully did what the bosses told him, which reveals the workings of the political system in a very dramatic way. But at that point, the intellectuals got the idea too. You got to be against the war. So all of a sudden, everybody turned out to be a long-time opponent of the war. It wasn't there was exactly the opposite up till then. And then the Kennedy memoirists, like Schlesinger and Sorensen and Hillsman, all the people who had been doing the memoirs of this magnificent Camelot, they redid them. And it turned out, and the new version turned out that Kennedy was against the war and he was trying to get out, and it was all this, we were all going to get rid of it, and then this Texan came in and so on. And it's just totally false. And in fact, if you compare it, in this same book, one chapter of it just compares the pre-Tet versions with the post-Tet versions by the same people, and they're completely different. I mean, you read, say, Arthur Schlesinger's got this book, 1,000 Days, which is like a diary of the Kennedy administration. It tells everything that happened every day. There's a hint that anybody even thought about getting out of Vietnam. But in his later book, we were all trying to get out, and so on and so forth. I mean, all you hear about it is fabricated. I mean, all this business about, and it's falsifying documents and so on. But it's a big thing on the left. It's helped rebuild the image, and it is a comforting image, the golden age that we lost, that kind of image which we were part of constructing. I mean, we had this great project, the society, this and that, which is complete garbage.
I don't want to do it anymore.
Well, you see, that used to be true of the organized industrial workforce. I mean, the unions, here it's interesting to compare the United States and Canada. because they're pretty similar societies, but the labor movements were quite different. The labor movement in Canada was community-oriented. The labor movement in the United States was individually oriented. So like the auto workers would go on strike, and they would get a good deal for them, so they'd get pensions and health care and so on. But when the auto workers in Canada went on strike, they got a good deal for the community. And that's where the national health care comes from, and the other services. And the society just distinguished sharply on this. But in those days, when the industrial unions were strong enough to make a deal with the employers, and usual contract, we'll keep the workforce quiet if you give them pensions. At that point, workers did want to retire. So they wanted to retire and go fishing, live on their pension and so on. But that's declined. That's declined because of the neoliberal measures, which simply reduced wages and increased hours and cut benefits and attacked the unions. So now you're kind of, you just got to worry about how I'm going to take care of myself. They're very frank about it. Like Alan Greenspan, the great saint, when he testifies to Congress about what he calls during the Clinton years, this marvelous economy he's presiding over, he explicitly attributed it to what he called growing worker insecurity. Because if you get growing worker insecurity, it's healthy for the economy. Because then these guys don't ask for anything. They don't ask for wages and benefits, and they work harder. And this business of I'm going to retire and live somewhere disappears. Because you're going to have to keep working just to keep alive. It was because of this highly self-centered character of the union leadership. Our responsibility is to, what they want, what they were, what union leaders are, just contractors for the labor contractors for the employers. So we'll keep our workforce quiet, but you're going to have to pay off that workforce by giving them pensions, not national health insurance.